Well, hello everybody. This is Professor Olson, and we are entering in the socialization chapter. I've tried to do the resolutions on the screen as best as I can, but it is what it is. So I hope this is useful for you. I'm going to record for about 15 minutes. I'm not going to go through the whole um, PowerPoint, but I'm just, as always, going to hit the good parts. Some weeks there'll be videos of lectures, and some weeks there won't. Obviously, this week well, this right here is just a narration. So, anyways, let's get started on socialization. It is a good chapter, and it's a great chapter to start off with because it has to do with everything foundationally with sociology. Um, we're going to talk about the role of socialization, the self, and socialization. Uh, we are going to talk about agents of socialization and um, how socialization affects us throughout our life course. Important note here to take is that there's a distinction between life course and lifestyle, and I'll go through over that a little later. And then aging and its effect in society, and then also we're going to end up with an introduction of a very interesting theorist. His name is E.O. Wilson, and I will end up with that. Okay. Um, the three areas of socialization have to focus on how do we become ourselves, and how do we become ourselves. Really, what we're talking about is how do we become ourselves in terms of our identity and personality and behavior. Those are the three main areas that we're talking about there. Who shapes our identity, personality, and behavior, and then how does that all change over time? What are the areas that it changes over time? Um, when do they change, and what are the stages that typically people go through? Um, it's fascinating to see that there are massive patterns about how people develop, and we all kind of have these times that we hit development um, more rapidly than others. The definition of socialization is a lifelong process through which people learn attitudes, values, and behaviors that are appropriate for members of a particular culture. So it's important to note here that we're talking about culture already. What's appropriate in a certain culture will definitely not be appropriate in another, could not be appropriate in another, I should say. And these culture really dictates attitudes and values and behavior. And so, but there's some similarities between all that. And when we get into the culture chapter, you'll see what we're talking about. Social scientists acknowledge the significance of interaction between heredity, nature, and environment, which is nurture. And at the end of this, we're going to have a little bit of time exploring the differences between those two things. People think that there's a right and a wrong with that, and or that we know that things are more nature and or more nurture, and we definitely are in the middle of figuring that out as sociologists, and we'll talk about that. However, I would say that sociologists tend to come down on the side of nurture, and I'm sure you can guess why. Um, Nurture, the environment, provides us with more to study as sociologists. The people that study heredity and nature tend to be biologists and people of that sort. Um, and so we have, the first person to really pioneer evolution, for example, and heredity was a fellow that went to my school. I just got done with Edinburgh. His name was Charles Darwin, and so his title was a naturalist. So that kind of is an interesting little thing there. Um, Social environment. So let's talk about the environment. There's a little spot in your book that discusses extreme childhood isolation, and it's called Feral Children, and how if they miss, and this is an important note for you, if they miss a certain time of socialization, uh, pardon me, they become not unable to catch up. There's certain developmental things that they'll never catch up with. So that's why it's super important for parents and educators to really do a good job with children prior to the age of 8. They've seen that there's a lot of development that happens socialization-wise. And this is the case of Isabel and Jeannie. And so you should read that or just kind of go over that in your chapter. Primate studies have also showed primates being ape species and monkeys. They showed that isolation has an effect on development at an early stage too with those. This is the chapter. You can read that, or the little story. You can read that on your own time. The twins, there was a huge study on twins, and they talked about Oscar and Jack, who were separated, and then the Minnesota twin family. And interestingly, as you read the chapter, you'll note that they saw that there were times when they got back together and they were separated, they saw that they exhibited very many similar traits. Um, so that's interesting. They were separated, but then they exhibited traits, and yet there was a lot of differences too. So the debate really revolves around how much is nurture and how much is nature. Biologists will claim much more nature with epigenetics and things like that, and sociologists and psychologists, well, psychiatry does nature too, but so psychology will come down on the side of nurture for development as well. So these definitions, our idea of our self is studied in psychology, but it comes in sociology studies, and it's not a static phenomenon. It's dynamic. We're always adjusting how we view ourselves, and this continues throughout the stages of our lives for sure. Cooley, which is somebody you should know, he defined this term, the looking glass self, and we become who we are based on how we think. And I say this, how we think others see us. Oftentimes that's not right. We imagine how others see us, relatives, friends, and even strangers on the street, and in turn we imagine how others evaluate what we think that they see as intelligent, attractive, shy, or strange. Those are just examples as to how we think others see us. But obviously we never know, and so oftentimes there's a disconnect, or there's some divergence between what we think they see and what they actually see. And if it becomes a really big problem, that's a psych thing. They go over that in psychology. We define ourselves constantly, changing the definition of ourselves as a result of these impressions. Obviously, you're seeing that I'm hitting on the big parts here, and this is going to help you with your quizzes. The I, very Freudian here with the id and the ego, the I is an acting self. And the difference is in sociology, we talk about behaviors in terms of action. So we talk about the acting self that exists in relation to the me. And the me is the socialized self that plans actions and judges performances based on the standards we have learned from others. So that's where the socialization comes in. Socialization is a learned process. The significant other is is defined from Cooley as individuals who are most important in the development of the self, such as a parent, friend, teacher, coach, those types of things. That we tend to internalize the significant others and take parts of what we've learned from them and adopt those parts throughout our life. You can think of people that have affected you. I've had teachers and coaches that have significantly affected me, and you can think of yours. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead here. Herbert Mead is not to be confused with the anthropologist, but Herbert Mead is a sociologist, and he talked about the preparatory stage. And we're preparing to define ourselves now. This is all part of the socialization, and we're preparing to define ourselves. And we imitate, children imitate, and this is child development. We got a great child development program at MJC. Children imitate the people. That's the first thing they do, especially family members. As they're growing older, this is good to know for the quiz, as they grow older, we find that peers have even more of a significant effect on our development and socialization than even parents do. Gestures, objects, symbols, and things like that are what we learn first. And this is where we get our behavior, our personal gesticulation, and how we use these things to communicate. And then we move on, as Mead says, to the play stage, and then they pretend to be other people. And you've probably seen children do this with like Barbie dolls and firemen and firefighters, I should say. you know how children take on roles, doctors, teachers, often because that's first who they're exposed to, in their learning as teachers, and that's why you see that. You often see toddlers imitating their mothers by having babies, and it's kind of funny to see a little 3-year-old having a baby in a stroller, a little pretend stroller and stuff. It's part of the play stage. And then Mead continues on for children with the game stage, and then this is where they grasp their own social position, and then they learn how to interact with others around them based upon the position that they're in. The games are really good with that. This is one of the reasons why, like on soccer and a lot of children's sports, they like to switch them around in positions because they learn the interaction and how things are different, how they interact with people based upon their different stages. You can see a forward or a goalie or something like that. And then the generalized other rather is attitudes and viewpoints and expectations that other people have based on the role that you take. If for again to use this very simple example of soccer, if you're a forward, you're expected to score. If you're a goalie, you're expected to defend. These kinds of things, but it has wider and broader implications for other aspects of socialization. I just use soccer as a easy example that we can all relate to, or most of us can. And then we go, pardon me, to Goffman, who really talked about the dramatological role. And it's very similar to old Shakespearean stuff, but we're all actors on a stage, and we're trying to figure out how we fit in. You should understand these two terms, impression management. I'm not going to go over it. Face work, you should understand. It's effort to maintain proper image in public environment to avoid embarrassment. Not going to go over Freud that much, but you can read a little bit about it in your chapter. Piaget was a educational psychologist and cognitive theory. And cognitive theory is your thought process, not the thoughts themselves, but the thought process through the 4 stages of development. And these, again, if you get into education, you can study these. I'm not going to focus too much on these in our chapter. This is interesting. Family. It's the most important agent of socialization early on, and it continues to be important throughout life, but early on it's a big, big variable. And we learn cross-cultural variation, people that come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnicities. And then most importantly here well, obviously I gave an example there, but gender and race, and we learn about those things. We're going to talk about race a little bit later on, but we learn those things. And there's so much consternation about gender roles and what we learned. School, again, peer groups. As we go older, peer groups increasingly assume the role of me significant others as opposed to families. Yeah. Popularity, gender stereotypes, all these things as you grow older. Good little thing from your book there. You can look at that later. Media, massive influence right now. We socialize increasingly using media, TV, social media, technologies, all these things. Looking at other people's Facebook pages and seeing how they're promoting their lives. It's good, really interesting things. And then when we get older, we have the workplace. Religion plays a huge part in how we develop our socialization. Workplace is interesting because adolescents tend to get introduced to the workplace, but even no matter what the socioeconomic background, there are exceptions to this, but really no matter what our socioeconomic background, we tend to work for spending money for kids as a kind of a way to introduce them to the roles and socialization that they're going to have to adopt when they get older. Obviously government in some subtle ways, but I'm not going to go into that. And then rites of passage, massive amounts of rites of passage, like graduation, things that we pick out to tell someone that you've graduated and you've moved on. Sometimes they have graduated, and sometimes we pass them on, but we have these rites of passage. And then there's the life course approach that looks at the socialization throughout our lives, not just our childhood and adolescence. All right, I'm going to stop there, but I've hit the big parts on this. You should continue the slideshow for sure. There's many more slides, but you can see the things that you'll need to focus on throughout this. This is a good one to know. Okay, good luck. Read it all.